In today's fast-paced, chaotic world of modern technology, scientific advances, and instant information, what does it matter that 500 years ago, a lone monk, armed with his 95 church grievances and theological arguments, would ignite what would be called the Reformation? The more we look and the deeper we dig, we find the impact of that day surrounding us more than we may realize. The work of the Reformers changes religious life drastically, and this impact on religious life is everywhere in today's world. All of us can individually read the Bible and in a translation that works for each of us. The Busy Mom's Bible, the Girl's Bible, the Homeschool Mom Bible, even the Law Enforcement Officer's Bible. Or would you prefer King James, English Standard, New International, or perhaps a New Testament in original Greek? The same options abound for choosing which church to attend. Which denomination or non-denomination do you prefer? And today, being in the presence of God is seen in far more personal terms. And this more intimate relationship impacts how we worship, how we interact with one another, even what it means to live a Christian life. And it all began with the Reformation. The Reformers are strongly against enforcing religion by the sword or coercing people into a particular faith. This sows the seed for a pluralistic society where many different faiths can coexist in the same land. The legacy of the Reformation opens up the path to the religious freedom of today, being able to believe or not believe anything we choose. The impact of the Reformation today jumps straight off the pages of our history books. James Madison, the father of the Constitution and the author of the Bill of Rights, credits reformer Martin Luther and his doctrine of the two kingdoms for his ideas on church and state. In an 1821 letter to F.L. Schaeffer, Madison writes,
"It illustrates the excellence of a system to which the genius and courage of Luther led the way between what is due Caesar and what is due God. That without a legal incorporation of religious and civil polity, neither could be supported."
James Madison and other founders of the country valued the Reformation first of all, from the standpoint of the priesthood of all believers. In other words, the people are empowered to make decisions for themselves, not only with respect to their spiritual life, but also to as far as their life in this world is concerned. So you have really the seedbed for the birth of democracy in the Reformation.
I suspect what Madison was talking about, and at least the way we've come to understand it in our country, is that church and state refers to two institutions. The institution of government and then the institution of the church. Actually, we're talking about two institutions within the same realm. So in other words, when Luther talks about the two realms, he's talking about the two ways in which God rules. He rules in the left-hand realm. I would argue you could call it the realm of creation. And in the left-hand realm, God is ruling for the purpose of preserving life, enhancing life, supporting life within creation. The right-hand realm is where God works his work of redemption in Christ, gathering a new church for the sake of the new creation. Now, within those two realms, I think it's probably somewhat of a stroke of genius on Madison's part to speak of the distinction of two institutions within the left-hand realm.
The U.S. American principle of the separation of church and state, Luther would have found very unrealistic because he believed that every society needs some kind of ideological base. And he didn't think it was absolutely necessary for a functioning society to be Christian. He said Turkish society can also function well. And he thought ancient Rome, ancient Greece had a functioning society without the Christian basis that his society had. But he always saw leaders as working from some religious convictions about what is good for society, what it means to be human, what puts the world in its framework.
Now, with respect to the government itself, I think James Madison finds or plays a very important role, because he's really the author, the principal author of the Constitution. And what's unique about him is that, unlike Thomas Jefferson, who went to William and Mary in Virginia for college, James Madison goes to the College of New Jersey, which today is Princeton, which is a Presbyterian school, and he's exposed to Calvinism, which is part of the Reformation. And two things really stand out in terms of his thinking about the government. And number one is that in a Calvinist fashion, he recognizes the sovereignty of God. That God is the one ultimately to whom we owe allegiance. And so that feeds into his thinking about there needs to be religious freedom in America so that people are free to exercise the duty that they have, that transcends the duty that they may have to any form of society, any form of government, allegiance to any institution, and to exercise the allegiance that they have ultimately to God. And then secondly, in Calvinist fashion, he recognizes the factor of human depravity, human sinfulness. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that's really based upon Madison's understanding of Reformation theology.
Perhaps no other aspect of Luther's social and ethical teaching produces as much discussion or controversy as his phrase, two kingdoms. And whether James Madison rightly interpreted it or not, the fact remains that roots of the term separation of church and state can be traced back to the days of the Reformation. Martin Luther's two kingdoms doctrine teaches that God is the ruler of the whole universe, but that he does this in two ways. He rules temporal, earthly life in one way, which Luther often calls the left-hand realm, and our spiritual life of faith in another way, or the right-hand realm.
The two realms do belong together. They're the same work of God, but you might think of them as creation and redemption. And yet they're not two separate works. We would argue, and I think Luther would, that God's work in the left-hand realm of preserving life in this world is for the sake of Christ renewing everything in this world when he returns. So when I think about the left-hand realm and the maintenance of life, I think of a variety of ways by which God does that. He has provided things like institutions, whether it's family, government, the economy, to assist in the preservation, the promotion, and the flourishing of life. And so where the government then comes into play has to do with establishing laws for the preservation of life.
The founders of the United States recognized in Lutheran terms that there was a kingdom of the left hand. In other words, there is a God who is at work in the universe by virtue of his being our creator. He's not a distant God who is backed away from us, but governs the universe.
Luther believed that, in accord with Romans 13 and other passages in Scripture, that God had ordained temporal government. It was needed to keep order in a sinful world, and I think probably initially he thought it was only because of sin, but I think later there are some passages where he suggests that somebody's got to keep order even in Eden.
People in Europe had experienced persecution not only under the state and wanted freedom from the state, but they had also experienced persecution by the church. And so they wanted freedom from the church and its clerics and its laws as well.
What's unique in the American situation is that there is not a state church. So when it comes to defining who we are as a people, what our core values are, and what our purpose as a nation is, this cannot be defined by any church, because there is no established church in the United States. We have religious freedom and so forth, in contrast to the old world in Europe, where there was a state church, and the church's function in part was to help the state define who it is, what its values are, what its purpose is. So the founders here had to define this for themselves, apart from the church.
One great constitutional scholar, Walter Burns, once said that the founding fathers solved the religious question in America by not solving the religious question in America. Had they tried to solve it in a stipulative way that solved everything, it wouldn't have worked.
And so you have Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence saying, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created, a creator God, are created equal, and that we have these inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." So there is the recognition of values that are transcendent, that there is a creator God. There's also the recognition that the best way to give allegiance to these values and to this God is to be in service to our fellow human beings. So this constitutes a kind of civil religion. It's revealed to us all in nature. It's there in natural law rather than in the divine revelation. Fits very well with what Luther talked about as the kingdom of the left hand. And the church has its role to look after the spiritual well-being of people, and where they put their faith as far as their salvation is concerned, and the faith that governs their daily lives, which would fit in with Luther's kingdom of the right hand.
I think George Will, a neoconservative writer, would just say, if you want to talk about liberties, you better know you're talking about Luther. And I think there's a good claim to be had here in that he made people tremble, rulers. He gave people who were more extreme than he, the Mennonites and the Anabaptists, the beginning for their charter, as it were. So I think you can't tell the story of modern liberty without him, but I think we have to know that there are limits to what he meant by liberty and what liberty has become.
So the founders said that unless there were churches that were calling people's attention to these values beyond themselves, also over in the kingdom of the left-hand, democracy would not work, because allegiance to these values would cause people to realize that we're in this to serve the common good. We're not just to serve ourselves, but we're in this to serve the common good of the country.
The 16th century is a time of great social and economic upheaval. Centers of money are shifting, and a rising form of capitalism begins to challenge the church's thoughts on money. Before, money could be used to secure salvation through buying indulgences or giving alms to the poor. But now the Reformation gives money a new focus and purpose. Salvation is not purchased, but is from beginning to end God's gift. Money is for our daily calling in the world and for service to society and neighbor. The faithful Christian life now means working hard, being successful, and earning money, all to the glory of God. Today, the work hard and be successful ethic may often be distorted, but its roots lay in the Reformation.
Time is money. He that can earn 10 shillings a day by his labor, and goes abroad or sits idle a half of that day, though he spends but 6 pence during his diversion or idleness, he has really thrown away 5 shillings besides. Remember that money can beget money, and its offspring can beget more.
If time is money, if a normal working day would be such amount, but you only spend half of it working and the rest in idleness, you have to count the money that you would have made. The money is lost. There's a sense that money generates additional money.
He that kills a breeding sow destroys all of her offspring to the 1,000th generation. He that murders a crown destroys all that it might have produced, even scores of pounds.
Well, that's just not a Reformation concept. This is a very American concept, a very foundational principle in thinking about money.
A seminal work on capitalism comes in 1934, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism by Max Weber.
Protestantism has given birth to a kind of work ethic that is the engine behind the spirit in a capitalist economy. So his argument is quite specifically that there are shifts in the Reformation on the way of thinking about vocation, about money, that enabled the possibility of capitalism to go in the direction that it did.
The old feudal society is quite different.
The feudal society has a very different arrangement in terms of labor and work and property. There's this oath of fealty, this oath of loyalty that is taken between a feudal lord who owns the land, protects the land, or perhaps has a claim actually on the family members, the newborn children on his land. And he's supposed to be there to protect them, to protect his land, to guard them, and to be their assurance that the world will remain in order. In exchange for the work and the ability to work the land safely, they receive some of the bounty of that land. They also give a significant portion of the bounty of the land and often of their time to the feudal lord.
That's a very different view than if you work hard, then the produce is yours. These are my taters. I planted them. I dug them. They're mine. And who's going to tell me that I owe them to him?
Other things have come into play to move European society out of feudalism to a place that people can say, this property is mine, this work is mine. Luther was living in this transitional period. This shifting stretches from 12th or 13th century into the 16th and 17th century, a long period of transition where goods evermore ceased to be a means of exchange and money replaced goods.
A key characteristic of Weber's argument is this notion that the Protestant Reformation, specifically Luther and then the heirs of Luther thereafter, had a new view of secular vocation, that it was a Christian calling to be a cobbler, to be a farmer, as well as to be a mother or a father. This Christian calling of the secular life, of a life of work and labor, Weber points out is the key shift in Reformation thinking. He notes that when you really see momentum behind capitalism coming, it happens not so much within Lutheranism, but especially as it plays out in Calvinism in countries dominated by Calvinism. The theology of vocation or Christian calling gets tied first for religious reasons and then just for reasons, practical reasons. That with hard work and with one who works well and makes money, has property, that's how you glorify God, living not only as a good cobbler, but the very best cobbler. And you can be frugal, and you can use that money wisely, etc.
The Reformers say being the best you can be leads to living your Christian vocation to its fullest. But for good or bad, this inadvertently opens up the road to our capitalistic society.